All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this special session with the Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab. If you don't already know me, my name is Alexis Bateman, and I am a research scientist at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, the director of MIT Sustainable Supply Chains, and also a course lead for SC3X Supply Chain Dynamics. And I'll also be co-hosting this with Dr. Borrella, who is a research scientist at MIT CTL as well, and the course lead for SC1X. So today, we're really fortunate to have the Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab with us, a highly regarded lab in all things humanitarian supply chains. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Jarrod Goentzel, the founder and director of the lab, Ms. Chelsey Graham, and Mr. Tim Russell, research engineers with the lab, who are really doing hands-on work in the space, and really excited to hear about their work today. Thank you, Jarrod, Tim, and Chelsey, for taking the time today. All right, so we'll dive right in. We're going to be an interactive session today, so please fill out the polls. I won't talk about some of the administrative stuff. I'm going to hand that over to Inma, but let's fire up the first poll, Sam. All right, Inma?
It's out. Yeah. So the agenda for the session, what we're going to do for the about next 10 minutes is have Jarrod provide some context on the Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab's work. Then Alexis and I will ask some questions that we have prepared based on some questions that we've received already. And then the last 20 minutes will be saved for your questions. So please use the webinar Q&A feature to ask these questions. You can see it at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom application. And please be sure you're logged in with your name. We will not read any anonymous questions, so please do that. And we will also be sharing a couple more polls during the event, so be ready to participate. So Alexis, let's check on that poll and see what we got.
All right, let's conclude that poll, Sam, and we'll give it a quick read here. So, well, I like that 61% of you guys are generally expanding your supply chain knowledge. So absolutely a great thing to do, continuous learning. I know many of you guys here are from the MicroMasters program, so obviously that's in line, but those of you that are not in that program, great. We're happy to share and dive into some of the work of Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab. And then wow, 21%. You got some future supporters, Hustle, are interested in working in humanitarian supply chains. So that's awesome. Really exciting to hear that.
Yeah.
All right.
And 8% are already working in humanitarian supply chain management. So that's great.
All right, with that, are you ready to kick it off, Jarrod?
Yep, I'm ready to go here. Let me share my screen. Can you see it now? Okay. Well, I'm also excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm excited that people are both interested in expanding their knowledge in supply chain as well as exploring the humanitarian space. You know, we do believe that the humanitarian context provides a rich opportunity to think about a supply chain in a different way because it changes the basic application of the knowledge of supply chain. So hopefully this will help you think about how to further expand your thinking and your approach on supply chain, but also if you have an interest, show you some of the ways that can connect. So, and we specifically, as mentioned earlier, we're talking about our work really related to COVID this spring. There's been a lot of, that's a new context that really provided stimulus for thinking about supply chains for a lot of humanitarian organizations. So adding that layer of a pandemic on top of more traditional humanitarian issues has made it even more complex, and actually has raised a lot of awareness about supply chain to people who may not have ever thought about supply chains. So there's it's been an interesting year on several fronts. So I'm going to give you a little background about our lab and first start with our Center for Transportation and Logistics. A lot of you are familiar with this, but this idea of we're really grounded in practice. So if you see on the left side of the screen there, it's the partners. We work with companies. So a very rich engagement with the private sector in our research across the center. And in the middle, you see those research focus areas, of which humanitarian supply chain is one. But there's lots of different ways that our center engages with practice and driving research forward. And then that feeds into our education program. The online and the residential programs all leverage this context. But I wanted to emphasize that CTL really starts from practice. How do we solve problems that are really grounded in practice? And how does that turn into framing the teaching and helping to learn concepts based on that rich practical context? What the Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab brings to CTL that's a little different is our partners, although we work a lot with the private sector, and you'll see that, our main sponsors of the research are not companies. They are mostly from, I'll be honest, the US government is one of our strongest partners. So you see the upper left here, and these are taken from our website, and the upper right, you see the link to our website. You can go see more, but in the upper left here, you may not recognize all these logos. They're not brand names. So USaid is the US Agency for International Development. This is the part of the US government that provides aid and support globally in terms of helping to support development activities and to respond to crises in a humanitarian setting. Next to that is the Department of Homeland Security, which under the Department of Homeland Security is FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is the lead agency for the US government in providing resources to state and local government to meet people's needs through the government channel and to help fill gaps following a crisis. So those are two of our primary sources of funding for research and shaping our research agenda and supporting it. We also work with a lot of partners in doing this. So WFP is the World Food Program. It's a UN agency that delivers food aid around the world. We've done a number of projects over the years with them. The next logo is Partners in Health. It's a Boston-based NGO in the healthcare sector, providing the ability to strengthen health systems in low and middle-income countries. The next one is a private sector health alliance of Nigeria. We've worked with them, who are trying to engage the private sector more in Nigeria and meeting people's needs. The next one is the International Red Cross. So working with NGOs directly, like International Red Cross. The little arrow here is IRC, International Rescue Committee. This one here is a funny logo called for Lincoln Laboratory. It's a part of MIT that we often work with in supporting the US government and its work. CNA and JSI are both organizations that also work with the government to help further research. So, and then also in the bottom right here is the American Logistics Aid Network, which is actually came out of the profession of supply chain management. The Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals following Hurricane Katrina pulled together and helped create this entity that coordinates support from the private sector during crisis. And you'll see that a lot of our research is really aimed at that, leveraging this rich context that CTL has and understanding the private sector and bridging it to help humanitarian actors, whether they're the government or nonprofits, better engage the private sector in supporting a response to a crisis. And then our research, if you want to go click, there's several projects that we provide some highlights of on, and one of them I'll highlight here is with the USAID Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance that provides aid overseas. I highlight this one because this is one that might fit into some of your knowledge and if you've taken the SC2X on supply chain design and thinking about a network and where are you going to put inventory around the world to respond to a crisis. Well, we've developed some models to help them think about where to put inventory stockpiles to respond to an emergency. And back to expanding your knowledge generally, we typically think about designing a supply chain for ongoing demand, like a retailer that continues to provide sales and has stock in a store, and we're constantly replenishing. The context of a disaster response is very different. We aren't looking at demand as an ongoing continuous flow, and we're using historical data to forecast it. Instead, it's an event. We're trying to guess, when is the next event going to happen? And what are all the risks that are around the world? And how do we have stock for a very uncertain demand that might materialize based on a crisis? So the underlying demand changes completely, which causes us to think about optimization of inventory in a different way to support a very different demand stream. So that's an example of how just changing to a humanitarian context will change how you apply some of the knowledge that you gain through the MicroMasters. We also develop specific education and engagement opportunities for people who have supply chain backgrounds, especially, but even if you don't. So we have a course at MIT in the spring, SCM 283 on humanitarian logistics that basically takes a lot of the theory from supply chain and applies it in this context and helps you identify, giving some different assumptions, which models and which theory from supply chain applies to the humanitarian context, and helps really think about how do you plan effectively to be able to respond quickly. And then there's an opportunity in this course to do projects with some organizations in the latter part of the spring. It's a half semester course in the spring that we then offer some opportunities to engage further in the spring. We also have a collaboration with universities in the Boston area, such as Tufts and Harvard, that also have humanitarian programs that specialize in health or in food security. And then there's collaborations, including the picture there is a simulation of a disaster response that happens every April. The universities work together to create a rich simulation where the students go out in the woods for 3 days, and we put together a rich simulation experience of responding to an international crisis. One other thing I want to highlight in terms of engagement is the Health and Humanitarian Logistics Conference. This is a conference that our lab has been supporting for almost a decade, and it actually is happening next week. So if you want to really learn more about this context, it's online this year, so it's easy to attend next week, Tuesday through Thursday, and there's the link in there if you want to be able to engage with more practitioners. It's a very practice-oriented conference. There's a few academics, but we really convene practitioners trying to move things forward on this topic. And then finally, I want to just give a little showcase of what we've been doing during COVID, during the age of COVID. So this started by an engagement in 2017 during a very rich hurricane season where there was a lot of activity. There were 3 major storms that hit the US, and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, had for a while been wanting to better work with the private sector, which has a lot more capacity to respond. So if you're talking about grocery stores like Walmart and Kroger, these large chains have a lot more supply chain capacity to provide food and water than the government does. So how to work with them better to make the response comprehensive, and then the government can fill gaps where the private sector is not able to. We learned a lot through that year. We even convened an event at CTL in December. You see that picture up in the upper right of a roundtable of private sector actors, mostly some government, to talk about how can we do this better going forward. This then led to a project sponsored by FEMA to do a research on how to do this based on that hurricane season. And it was led by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in the US, which is a body that really convenes expertise to help shape policy for the government. And out of that, we were actually part of this research effort doing advanced analysis in this phase 3 of helping to develop some tools and ways of thinking about how supply chains, specifically private sector supply chains, react to a crisis in the US. And from that, there are several recommendations. And I do want to highlight from the recommendations on how the US government can do things better going forward, that the key is how to rapidly restore private sector supply chains, the regular supply chains that are serving communities. And then to do that, that's the primary thing, is that focus should be on helping strengthen the local actors, the local grocery stores, the local gas stations in meeting people's needs during a crisis. To do that, there needs to be a better understanding of the systems and the dynamics so that we can support decisions in real time. And that's where we've been doing a lot of work in our lab in developing tools and analytical frameworks to better understand how the private sector reacts to a crisis, and therefore better target decisions during a crisis where the government can most effectively deploy its support and its resources. And I would say a part of that is also recommendation 4, you see down there, develop and administer training. This is exactly the kind of thing we're looking to leverage opportunities like MicroMasters and students who have this knowledge to be able to engage in this kind of activity going forward. If you're working with a company, how to engage with the government, but we're really also trying to help the government understand the private sector. So that unique context that we have at CTL of working with the private sector is really playing out to broaden the engagement and supporting disaster survivors following a crisis. If you want to learn more about that work, we actually recorded a webinar that highlights some of the research that came out of this study that was released in January this year. Of course, the pandemic has caused us to stop thinking about hurricanes, but we still have hurricanes during this crisis. But anyway, there's a good description. It's a 1-hour webinar from the spring that really summarizes that research, including some of the work we've been doing at MIT in our Computational Analytics and Visualization Education Lab, the CAVE lab. So good chance for you to learn further there. The final thing is I'll just say we've been applying this knowledge throughout COVID. This is the work for FEMA. We were part of a group called the Supply Chain Analysis Network with a couple other partners that do assessments in real time for FEMA about the private sector capabilities during COVID. So we had a whole string of assessments focused on the one on the left here is on grocery and grocery supplies, providing food and water to communities during COVID, focusing on Puget Sound, focusing on New York, and then a broad study of how freight is moving and any constraints in moving freight during COVID. So that's one set of work. We've also done work with USaid, that international part of the US government, focusing on overseas development to assess systems in Uganda and how are the markets working or how are they being constrained during COVID-19. And we just put out a summary report of this, that all of these things will be curated. The ones for FEMA are still under final review, but we should be putting all these out available on DSpace for you to look at the kind of work we've been doing if you're curious about it. Including things like learning, like I'll just highlight one little graph here. I'm sorry, I keep talking, but one of the interesting things is that there's a lot of informal supply chain activity in Uganda, and this ICBT is the informal cross-border trade. So Uganda is a very good place to grow food supplies, so maize and beans and so forth. And they often trade with neighboring countries like South Sudan and Kenya. And COVID has really put a constraint on crossing borders, which has really had an impact on the market. And so you can see that the normal cross-border trade, this blue line, it just dropped to zero. It really is. And that has changed the way that markets are working in Uganda. And so we tried to track that and help USaid understand what support they might be able to provide in helping the market adapt and remain resilient to providing food for neighboring countries, but also, keeping it sustainable in Uganda. So those are some examples of the kind of work we do and how we take our knowledge on supply chains and apply it to our research partners during the age of COVID. So.
Thank you, Jarrod. Thank you so much for the great introduction to some of the work of the Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab. We can see like how many great contributions you've created, and also like how passionate you are about the work you do. Now we want to dive into some questions. So we know that in the past you did some work on different viruses, and particularly during the Ebola epidemic. So we would love to know more about what you learned during that experience and how it is informing your current work, particularly now that we're facing COVID. Mm-hmm. Before you answer, let's launch a new poll to the audience. There we go. So yes, Jarrod, please let us know what you learned from the Ebola experience and how you're applying that today.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm actually going to share another slide here because I think it'll be helpful to talk to some pictures about this experience. So this is a very different kind of thing. You've seen with the national academies, we're doing traditional kind of academic research, developing tools and visualizations. This work was very hands-on. And our lab actually has that tendency that when we find the right opportunity, we're willing to engage very directly in a response effort, but when we're invited. And so in this case, we had ongoing partnerships I mentioned with Harvard and other schools, including that led to connections at Boston Children's Hospital and UMass Medical School. So medical doctors who had been working in Liberia prior to the Ebola outbreak for a number of years doing medical training. And they had just set up the first residency program since the war, right in 2014 that was getting going. And they were hearing from their residents that with Ebola, the protective equipment was going mainly to the Ebola treatment units, which is appropriate. Okay? The people providing treatment for Ebola is important, but it needed also to go to hospitals so that healthcare workers can continue to safely provide ongoing medical services. And so, being able to help women in childbirth, you put the health workers at great risk if they don't have the protective equipment to support other medical procedures safely while Ebola is there. And there were a lot of healthcare workers that unfortunately lost their lives, especially in the early days before they had protective equipment. So because of the medical school engagement with the government, we worked together, and then they said, oh, we need more supplies. There was a gap in terms of the support for the hospitals. And then the government of Liberia invited this collaboration that included our lab along with UMass and Boston Children's Hospital. And the main primary partner was the Liberia College of Physicians and Surgeons, which is this logo in the middle, to form this consortium in real time to provide support. And it's so the medical professionals provided the training, and they came to us to say, help us with the supplies, because doing training without the proper supplies is not going to be effective. We then reached out to some partners we work with at Avenir Analytics who have expertise in how to run a on-the-ground response. And there's a lot of team members that came together to make this happen. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the nature of this kind of supply chain, is that we had to procure goods at a time when everyone was trying to buy the same goods, which maps very well to what we've been experiencing this year. Everyone's trying to buy the same thing from the same sources. One of the interesting things is we were able to, through working with distributors, and we were able to mine and find an alternate channel of supply that was from a producer of protective equipment, who doesn't typically sell to the medical sector, but sells for industrial sector, but it meets the same standards. So we were able to find an alternate supplier, and then we had to secure transport to move things quickly. And we have to do this in an effective way so that the goods can arrive right on time for the training to happen at the hospital, and it all has to happen quickly. So we got our procurement started. We didn't get our funding until late November. By January, we had this plane loading in Miami, Florida. And this is a rare situation where we're actually running an operation. So usually we're studying. So the pressure was kind of on our lab to actually execute, because if we don't deliver, how can I teach effectively and tell a student what to do? So the pressure was on to make sure we got things loaded on the plane effectively. But one of the big things is when you arrive in country to make sure you can clear customs effectively. And that you then have planned the local storage, which is this tent here. You can see me in the tent taking inventory, along with the transport to finally deliver it to the hospital, so that then the workers on the far right can put it on. All of this has to be planned ahead of time, and we didn't have very much time to do it. But I'll say a couple of things I learned. First of all, I learned that when you actually have enough funding to charter a plane, there's a jump seat, so you can actually fly with the goods. So for me, this was a thrill. I actually got to fly on the plane with the goods and make sure that when it arrived, we cleared customs, that we got stock, and we got it delivered. So it was a thrill for me to be able to experience this. But I also learned a lot about how engaging with professionals, especially the medical professionals, and understanding the demand better so that we could buy the right goods at the right quantities, understanding the procedures for which the protective equipment is needed. I don't have the expertise on which procedures in a hospital require the equipment. We needed that expertise. So how to do demand planning with more than just forecasting models like you might learn in a MicroMasters. I mean, those are useful, but again, we don't have a historical data set to do any projections for. We can't do time series. We have to work with experts, distill from their knowledge base what is useful for us to come up with a plan for demand, that then we can start go out and define a supply plan. So this aspect of engaging stakeholders on demand planning, very important. And then also when you go to find supply, we learned a lot about how, the supply chain for protective equipment is broader than just medical, and looking at different kinds of supply chain actors and understanding tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers is something that a lot of the medical procurement professionals don't really understand as well, because they are used to working just with the first tier distributors. So this rich supply planning, understanding how a supply chain is structured and works, is something that we really bring to the table to combine with that expertise on the demand planning from the medical doctors. So together, the medical doctors and the supply chain doctors can put together a comprehensive plan to make sure that the healthcare workers have what they need. we're now applying this directly with some projects both on campus at MIT to make sure we have enough protective equipment for campus at this moment. And we also have a new project with a local hospital network and the state of Massachusetts to help them figure out how to set up appropriate supply of PPE during this crisis. So we learned a lot from that experience of doing it hands-on. It kind of fits the nature of our center and our lab to get our hands dirty with something, learn from it, and then continue to apply it in our future work.
Thanks so much, Jarrod. That was really inspiring. I think a lot of kind of lessons coming out from that, and obviously you're applying it in real time during COVID. So quick 2 administrative things. We'll get back to the poll results. Thank you guys so much for filling it out. So we'll discuss that in just a minute. Also, I see a ton of questions in the chat. Make sure to put those in the Q&A. We're going to save them for the end. And I know we're not going to get through all of them, but please do put them up there so we can address them at that time. So now we're going to jump into the extension question, which is how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted humanitarian response? Tim or Chelsey?
I can start. I'll give Jarrod a break so he doesn't have to keep talking for so much. So I think the first thing that I would say about how COVID has changed things, it's changed things for humanitarian organizations the same way it has for lots of businesses. So you've got the same issues that businesses have, like volatility, like demand volatility, supply volatility. So like on the demand side, you've seen surge for essential businesses. You've seen like PPE demand go through the roof. That's going to be the same problem that any business that needs PPE, you're going to have the same problem with the humanitarian side. You've got halts for non-essential businesses. So things like restaurants closing, things like hair salons closing have caused these big shifts in demand where channels have changed. So you've gone from like wholesale food service deliveries to restaurants, that channel completely drying up, to everybody buying things at grocery stores. You've gone from like the big industrial rolls of toilet paper where everybody uses those at work, to that demand just drying up and everybody trying to buy toilet paper from home. On the supply side, you've got longer lead times. You've got things where like factories and plants are closing in China and people are not able to understand where or not able to have good visibility into when supply is actually going to come to them. I'll mention one other thing, and that's like, at least here in the United States, there's been lots of what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions, where you've put in all these restrictions around how close you can be, how many people can be in a place, geographically where you can operate. And this has caused lots of planning problems. So for example, like a business like in Georgia delivers to nearby states like Alabama and Florida. All of these different jurisdictions have different rules, and when you can travel, when you can go to warehouses, how you have to interact when you get to those warehouses, what documents you need to be carrying. All of these sort of rules that are meant to slow down the spread of the virus are affecting planning and your ability to operate. So I'll stop talking for a little bit. I'll give Chelsey a chance if you want to say something.
Thanks. Yeah, building on what Tim said, we've seen absenteeism in the workforce also be a great disruption. And this is caused directly from COVID-19, people getting the disease, or indirectly for those that have safety concerns or need to stay home for childcare purposes. The other issue too, and this goes into the operational side of things that Tim was talking about, are related to PPE. So a lot of these warehouses need additional PPE for their workers to keep them safe, and those supplies are stretched thin. So that can cause a disruption in the workforce as well. So across the board, we've seen that the absenteeism rates have been higher, and due to this, there's been delays within warehousing especially, and capacity has taken a hit. And that also applies to transportation as well. We've been talking to transporters that have had a hard time keeping drivers in their seats. And this has really tightened the freight market. And recently with Hurricane Laura, we were just activated by FEMA for that response. And we saw the freight market was doing some really strange things. And we were trying to dig in and figure out why. So nationally, there's been just very tight capacity, and prices have been really high. And then enter the hurricane, and you see those things regionally shift and create additional capacity constraints and an imbalance in the market on where demand and supply for actual trucks is. So those shifts have also been causing disruptions on top of COVID. And then in addition to that, with Hurricane Laura, we've seen COVID create issues with sheltering and evacuation. So not as many people can be on one shuttle bus during evacuation. So that's more wheels on the road and more fuel consumption, which is always an issue during a hurricane. And then also sheltering. So typically FEMA will put people in mass shelters. And this year for Hurricane Laura, they've had to put people into hotels. So you're looking at higher cost there and just logistically something different that FEMA's not used to doing. So yeah, I think we touched on a lot of different things there.
If I could add one thing here too, and it ties back to, we learned during Ebola that we need to protect lots of different kinds of essential workers, not just the ones treating Ebola, but the ones supporting pregnant women. Make sure they have the equipment and the training to do this. What we learned this year is that we need to support lots of different essential workers when the virus is airborne and can go anywhere. And this is warehouse workers and drivers and everything. And we've been with our partners a strong advocate for workplace safety across the supply chain and helping people understand that resources need to make sure that the supply chains can keep moving, that the workers in that supply chain are essential, and protect them is important. And actually that will be a theme, just to highlight again, the conference next week. I'll be running a panel featuring lessons learned in the US, in Mozambique, in Zambia, around protecting the supply chain workforce. It's going to be next Thursday, midday. So check the Health and Humanitarian Logistics Conference if you're curious to learn more about that work.
Thank you so much for all your insights. I think this is super relevant and interesting. Hurricanes are hard enough, but with COVID, things just can get totally out of control. So it's really interesting that people like you are doing research on how to make this better and in a safe way for everyone. So let's see what the result of our poll is. What we asked our participants is, what are the products and services most commonly needed during a crisis? And most of them think water and food are like clear winners, followed by emergency medicine, blankets and bedding, and only 6% just marked other. So it would be great if you could just share with us what are your insights on this.
I'll start off. So in some ways it's a trick question because it really depends on the type of disaster or event that's being responded to. And so in particular, I've been working with OFTA, which I think Jarrod mentioned, and they pre-position items, as does FEMA. So water, definitely, FEMA pre-positions, MREs, which are meals ready to eat, things that don't expire. Other items that are similar to that are hygiene kits, kitchen sets, blankets, buckets, plastic sheeting. And so they're really a wide gambit of items, and it's highly dependent on the disaster itself and other organizations that are involved in the response.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and second that. Jarrod mentioned the class that happens every spring, the seminar where we get together in the woods and we go through a simulated disaster with the folks from Harvard and Tufts. And so if you get a chance as a MicroMaster student to come to MIT and get a degree, you can take that class. And it focuses a lot on needs assessment. And so it takes a look at trying to figure out how do you prioritize and assess what's actually needed. So like Chelsey said, every disaster is a little bit different. So like an earthquake in Turkey would have different needs than an Ebola response in Liberia, or when like Superstorm Sandy hit New York and New Jersey in the winter. So those needs are all a little bit different, but there's some common things that people normally need to have. Jarrod, did you want to jump in and add anything to that?
Well, I just, it kind of reemphasizes that need for us supply chain professionals to engage with experts who can better understand and assess needs, and that you don't have historical data. I mean, you may have some idea of what would likely be needed in a disaster, but that you get real-time data on needs from experts, and then you have to fit that into your supply chain, and your supply chain planning has to be able to take both sets of information, kind of what we would expect, and then real-time updates of what we need, and be flexible to adapt. And remember that when you're trying to adapt, the roads might be out, or the port may be closed, and so you have a lot of constraints as you start to get in a sense of the complex planning approach. And rather than throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we'll just figure it out in real time, there are things we can do to plan ahead, and that's one of the things that we try to teach in the course. The other thing is, if you're thinking about like, what can I do in a disaster, the best thing you can do is provide cash, because we never know which commodities are going to be needed. And so we always try to emphasize that. If you want to help out, it may seem like a good thing to go and get canned food items and provide direct supplies, but the experts on the ground know what's needed. And if we trust them and their expertise, because we never have enough resources to meet everything. So being able to target resources effectively, cash is the best way to then be able to target where there are gaps. So just another message that's important in terms of thinking about the response. Trust the experts to deploy the resources most effectively where they're needed.
That's super insightful, and I think particularly relevant for supply chain dynamics course that some of you guys are in right now, thinking about the greater context of which the supply chains operate, and obviously with which Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab operating in hyper-constrained environments, and how to kind of respond in real time. So I think super applicable and something to take forward as we get through the rest of the course. So now we're gonna pivot a little bit. Obviously thinking about some of the work that you guys do providing support for decision making. Can you tell us a little bit about the methods that you use to provide this information and support action on the ground?
I'll start with that. Methodology is something, of course, I love thinking about as an academic, which methods are going to be most appropriate. And I was trained as an operations research optimization person. So I started thinking about the world in terms of optimization models and how do we minimize cost. And the humanitarian work has forced me to expand that toolkit. And we often employ what I call a mixed methods approach. We'll use some different types of methods together to help solve the problem. Because, like you saw, for example, the work that Chelsey is doing with the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, we have a rich stochastic optimization model. And that's needed to provide metrics to help build insight on what's the most effective deployment by considering thousands of disasters at the same time and determining what. So only optimization can do that. But yet, what's needed in each disaster, then we have to be able to talk with experts and be able to translate, what are the parameters for a hurricane hitting this? What would that mean in terms of demand? So we need to elicit that from experts. And so we'll use different kinds of survey methods or creative approaches on multi-criteria decision-making to elicit from people what may be in their heads, but is not clear. In fact, one of the early research projects I did, we needed to figure out what's the objective function for our optimization model. And it's not just minimize cost, it's lots of things. It's also delivering things effectively with equity, the timeliness, all those fit together. And we elicited from experts by doing a particularly robust survey, is what it looks like to them, but it's got a rich methodology behind there called conjoint analysis, to then determine a weighted objective function that represents the expertise in the sector from working for decades in this area. So, that mixed methods approach to get your objective function for your optimization model. We use simulation. We did some recent work with the national academies using discrete event simulation. We use things like system dynamics, which is made at MIT, a field that was really cultivated and developed at MIT and has a lot of expertise. We have access to rich expertise in that area. So that's another method we employ. So lots of different methods coming together to apply supply chain theory into the context, which is the real key to solving the problem.
That's great, Jarrod. I love how you highlighted mixed methods and the importance of also including the opinion of experts when you're trying to solve a problem, right? Because we teach a lot of mathematical models in our MicroMasters, but that's not enough. that's needed and it's a good start, but then you also need to include like all this other knowledge that is out there to actually come to a good solution to solve the problem. So some participants today are part of our MicroMasters, I would say a lot of them. And as we saw in the first poll, many are looking to involve themselves in humanitarian supply chain management in the future. So what advice could you give them if they want to follow this path?
I could start on that. I guess the first thing I would say is that the MicroMasters certification, like if you finish the whole thing, that looks really good on a resume. And I guess I'd say that from firsthand experience. Like while we were working in Uganda, there was an organization called the 1 Acre Fund, and they had been training all of their supply chain professionals through the MicroMasters program. And so they were all taking it together all across Africa. They were all working together to take this course. And so I would say that like showing your interest in this and taking the profession seriously through doing a certification like this is something that humanitarian organizations value. I guess the other thing I would say is maybe look to volunteer with local organizations first. For example, like your local Red Cross or Red Crescent Society is a great place to start. Personally, I got into humanitarian logistics by doing volunteer work with the United States Peace Corps. And so I was abroad in a refugee impacted area and began to learn and see what was happening with the humanitarian side and got interested in it that way. Chelsey, did you want to jump in with anything?
Yeah, I would say also check to see if you work for a private company, they might have a foundation or they might have a philanthropic arm that would allow you to get involved and stay within your company. The humanitarian space needs to be able to leverage the private sector intellect and technology more. And there are some secondment programs. I know I used to work for a World Food Program, and they had a partnership with MasterCard. And they would, and also maybe some consulting firms too. And so they could send people over to work for a World Food Program for 6 months to a year. So I think these are other options as well that allow you to get involved and share what you're doing in the private sector with the humanitarian sector, which is really important.
And
that's great. No, go ahead.
Just add, if you work for a company that has such opportunities and you're looking for the right place to plug in, reach out to us. We'll help connect you with organizations like Chelsey mentioned. WFP has options, but we can maybe find some other organizations that would be open to that kind of engagement.
Great. No, that's really great insight. And I know that the MicroMasters appreciate that because clearly there's an interest in this area. So I'll ask the kind of follow-on question, which is you guys are clearly passionate about your work. And so can you just leave us with a thought about, well, we have Q&A after this, but what inspires you about humanitarian supply chain management? Obviously, it's very challenging, super fast moving. I know you guys sometimes are working 24 hours a day in the worst of cases. So what kind of drives you in this area?
I can go first. I think we all will all say a little bit. That we all came from the private sector, so I think we're supply chain people with diverse backgrounds, whether it's IE or OR. We enjoy problem solving, and I think combining that with the desire to also work on problems that provide others with the same opportunities that we have, or to lift people into better positions in life is something that I know personally motivates me.
Yeah, I guess I'll second that, Chelsey, and just to say that solving problems is something that I really enjoy, and being able to solve problems that have the ability to help people is just makes it even more worthwhile. So like all of us could be doing the same work in the private sector, but being able to do this work and help people is really what motivates us, or motivates myself.
Yeah, and it's the same kind of thing that it's nice at the end. I've enjoyed, and I still enjoy helping companies figure out how to do things more efficiently so that they can create economic value for their workers and for society. But I also, the social impact that we can have with our ability to make better use of resources and scarce resources to help people that are in need. If we can deploy those resources to meet more need, you know, the limited resources available to support people in needing situations. You know, if we can make them spread that further, then that makes me excited. And at the end, it's always good to think about like the individual person at the end of that supply chain that you're actually helping to serve. And sometimes we get caught in the bureaucracy and the complexity of organizations and everything, and that focusing aspect of how are we all working together to meet the needs of that person who just had the worst day of their lives is really a clear focus for our work.
It's definitely inspiring to hear you talk about all your projects and also about, your passion about it. So hopefully you've inspired some more people to join the same path. We're gonna run one last poll before we go to Q&As. We have a lot of questions, so I don't know if we're gonna be able to cover all of them. But let's launch the poll, and while it populates, we can start answering some of the questions. Alexis, have you chosen a good one already?
I grabbed a couple. One I can answer right away, which is MITx planning to offer MOOCs on humanitarian supply chain and sustainable supply chains? And Jarrod and I can both say, yes, they are in development, highly anticipated, and they will be coming TBD. Comment on that, Jarrod? Yeah,
it's I was making good progress and COVID hit, and we needed to actually put into action a lot of our knowledge. But yeah, no, it's exciting to think about how we can leverage the unique learning platform that edX offers to reach more people. And we hope to be doing that very soon.
Great. Yeah. So watch out for it. It's coming, but a little bit of disruption this year. So hopefully next year. So I'll ask another question by Isabella Long. So she says, how should we plan stock levels since the demand is highly variable and difficult to forecast? If we stockpile too much, the stock will not be able to use, or no one will be able to pay because the fund might expire. Therefore, in addition to physical stock, are there any best practices for virtual stock? Can you share those best practices?
Well, Chelsey, why don't you start talking about what you've been doing with the whole stockpiling project with USaid?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is it's definitely not easy. One thing that we found through the linear optimization or stochastic linear optimization model that Jarrod referenced for identifying, it's basically a model that balances the trade-offs between time and cost as well. So we're looking more at how quickly can an organization respond to a disaster given their inventory levels and where their warehouses are located around the globe. But in addition to that, knowing when a disaster is actually going to occur is kind of the crux of the problem, and how big it will be too. So what's going to be that impact in the total affected population? So something that we started exploring is how to combine current early warning platforms that exist to identify natural hazards by region and combine that with vulnerability indicators so that we can start to predict how big of an impact a disaster might have on a specific region. This can really inform what that, like knowing how big the impact is and how many people are going to be affected will inform the stockpile question. So how much inventory is actually required? And what would that inventory be based on the natural hazard in question?
And one thing I'll add to that is we also designed this up front not to be an optimization model to say organization Y, put your stock in this location and these locations, but instead, take multiple organizations because they're all responding together and say, if all of you use this tool, you could more effectively, pre-position things across the sector. And so we designed it around metrics, not around like telling you where to put stock, but rather if you put stock here, here's the value of it. And then we can use shadow prices from your optimization to then say, well, if I'm organization Z and I'm going to add some stock to a pre-position, where is the best place for me to add it given the risks that are out there? And so using that shadow price, we can help guide them toward a more system optimal rather than organization optimal solution. So that's one.
And also
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, adding to it, the insurance policy idea is like this model built off of some work you've done previously, right, Jarrod? And thinking about a organization really is trying to insure against a disaster, and what are the assets that they need to maintain to do that. And so there are going to be natural trade-offs and bets placed, basically.
And there are also some unique ways to engage risk pooling across organizations, not just in terms of the stock, but also in terms of procurement. How do they just together determine how to tap resources, which would be actually really useful if we had done that prior to COVID regarding personal protective equipment.
Let me just jump in with one more comment. Some like practical examples that organizations do today, like UNICEF has, they kind of divided their stockpile. They think about it in terms of like an immediate response, and then over time you get a better picture of what demand looks like. And so they've got stock to cover an immediate piece, but then they have contracts they can activate to then be able to get supply further on. So they've got things in place with the private sector to be able to call on them to get supply. When you don't know what demand really is going to be, it's great to have that in the back pocket. And we also see organizations like FEMA in the United States do that, where they've got these vendor managed inventory systems set up where, like, if they need water, they can go to their suppliers and the suppliers have it, but they don't always have to pull on it. So it's this sort of relief valve where you don't know what your demand is. You've got this ability to be able to call on more from the private sector with previously established contracts. So.
Awesome. We have so many questions. I'm just trying to select a few good ones. So for example, since you have been talking a lot about the interaction with the private sector and governments, and that's a big part of your work, right? You also like play this role of facilitator between them both. One of the questions from Sagar Kane is, how do they work together to provide disaster relief? He'd assumed that the private sector is driven by profits, of course. So do governments provide tax breaks or something like that, some incentives for them to help in the disaster relief? How do they incentivize them to actually get more involved?
I'll start with that, just saying, first of all, the economic incentives of companies also drives them to be responsive, in the communities. You think about retailers as the most obvious thing, but everybody up to supply chain also, if they can serve the needs of the community more effectively than the other retailers, then there's a competitive advantage in showing how responsive they are and resilient they are. So there is an economic incentive to do this well. So there's not, from our experience, that doesn't need to be a distinct incentive from the government. I think that a lot of times the trouble is that the government can provide unique support and capabilities. And sometimes that's about making some regulations which are in place for good reason during non-crisis moments, relaxing them during a crisis to help the private sector work better, or providing some direct support, in terms of like electricity and fuel are always needed to make a supply chain work. And so and that's where the government might be able to provide some direct support in terms of generators and fuel. So that interplay of how the private sector can best engage with the government, and the government see the value of, if we work with this company, which is, it's hard to do that because they can't show favoritism for any one company, but if they can figure out with the evidence that objectively this will expand the ability to respond, then the government can have the ability to target its resources effectively as well. So it's that, I don't think it's just a matter of an incentive of getting people to talk to each other and see the problem the same way. That once they do that, they naturally have an incentive to work together during a crisis.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting and a really important point. And I think this next question actually relates to one thing you said, which is, how do you control for price gouging within humanitarian supply chains? For about a month or so during COVID, several vendors increased the prices of masks, sanitizers, basic necessities. Are there contracted prices for goods within humanitarian supply chain agreements? Tim, you nodded your head. You want to start?
So a lot of it comes down to legislation where, like during hurricane season, the gas stations are watched like a hawk, and they are not allowed to price gouge. And any price that is taken has to be validated and verified. And so there's regulations that stop some of that. A lot of the time, you have pre-existing contracts if you're trying to buy things in a planful way, and those prices are prearranged, so before the gouging happens. But sometimes it's as simple as just calling out the fact that it's happening and shaming people. It's something that humanitarian organizations have to do. I don't know if you guys want to jump in with any other comments, Jarrod and Chelsey.
Say one thing we saw with that through some of the Allen calls that we were able to join, and Allen is the American Logistics Aid Network that Jarrod mentioned we work with. It's a convening of private sector players, and when things like that were happening with sanitizers and masks and gloves, they were trying to share best practices, essentially, like which suppliers were actually selling things decently, or going to some of the newer, I think it was when some of the distilleries were making hand sanitizers and things like that, to get creative in order to try to sidestep those suppliers that were price gouging.
Yeah, and Chelsey, I think that's a good point in that, like, this is something we learned during COVID, that organizations grouping together to do a bigger procurement can get away from some of the price gouging. So instead of small organizations buying separately, having a bigger pool of people going together and doing a procurement can get around the price gouging. And it's also a learning from COVID-19 that will hopefully help in future pandemics, that we know a lot more about where to go to get this sort of PPE and things like that, and how to approach it. So hopefully that'll go forward into flu season and more disasters going forward. So.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump on that, it emphasizes the importance of procurement planning and thinking ahead under different scenarios, and working with suppliers prior to a crisis to set up agreements and do that more effectively. But also during a crisis, Chelsey mentioned that, you know, different types of vendors. It's not only the price, but also the quality. You have to make sure that you're also getting a quality good, that you're not buying something and then delivering it and it's going to do more harm. So that coordination that happens in the humanitarian sector on pricing also happens on quality assurance to make sure that we're providing effective supplies.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your insights. And I have one, I guess it's going to be our last question. One of our participants would love to hear about the other side of the center's research, so the emerging market development area that we didn't have time to touch upon today. But maybe you could just share which are the main areas of research, or just, I know we only have a couple minutes, but just give an idea of what you do.
They're not that different. We've been talking about how we work with the private sector. And so in emerging markets, the work we've been doing, for example, in Uganda, is understanding how to make the markets work better. But that is the foundation for a more effective response to crisis. And in fact, in our work in Uganda, we've been helping pull together different parts of USaid, one focused on development and the other focused on humanitarian response, to see how the market strengthening work that we're doing is the foundation for a much better response to a shock like COVID. And so they fit hand in hand. They're not really that distinct. It's just that there's a different kind of an approach when we're supporting countries overseas in terms of, you know, making that sustainable development a goal, also make the market more resilient to shocks and crises.
Great, thanks. And I guess like we're sharing the webpage of your lab and also some resources. So if people are interested in knowing more, they can always go there. Because there were so much interest and so many questions that will unfortunately remain unanswered. So I guess we have the results from the poll. Maybe we can share those. Awesome. So we were asking everyone what was the most interesting part of today's session for you. And most people said understanding the constraints of operating during a crisis, and also expanding their knowledge of what constitutes a humanitarian crisis, which is great because that was the objective of the session. But they loved learning more about methods and practitioners and academics use to respond. I think we covered a lot of topics. And you inspired, 34% of them were inspired by your work, and they are now thinking to pursuing humanitarian efforts in their future. So I think that's a great result for the session.
But I'd say no matter if you work for a humanitarian organization or not, as you see, we work a lot with the private sector. There's opportunities for you to use your supply chain knowledge to help meet people's needs. And so look for those opportunities and let us help you find them if you're seeking actively. So love to be help connect people in leveraging supply chain knowledge because it's important.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jarrod, Tim, Chelsey, for this time today. Obviously, a very, very interesting and important session. We had so many questions we didn't get to today, so many comments, just sending you kudos on the work and also the interest. And I encourage all of you, there's going to be some links after the webinar to read about more of their work. Go to the website, see, obviously, Jarrod, Tim, and Chelsey gave tips on how you can engage. Obviously, the MicroMaster is giving you the tools to begin on that journey. So thank you so much for joining today. Thank you, Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.